Let me tell you about stocks and some of the nuances of these securities that will help you better understand this instrument. Let's start with a simple question. Why do companies issue stocks? Sometimes companies do it because it is prestigious. Because if it gets listed on the stock exchange, it will immediately increase the prestige and recognition of the company itself. And sometimes companies issue stocks in order to find financing that can later be used to expand the business. The advantage of such financing is that, unlike loans or issuing bonds, the company does not borrow money that must then be returned with interest. Moreover, the company attracts additional equity capital, which will improve its financial condition and help it in the future to obtain a loan on better terms. The main disadvantage of such financing is that, by issuing shares, the founders of the company are forced to reduce their own share of the business, which they give to new shareholders. I want to say right away that the new shareholder does not become a co-owner of the company. And if you have 10% of the company's shares, this does not mean that you own a tenth of the company. You own only a tenth of the shares, which gives certain rights. You can participate in shareholder meetings, vote at these meetings for certain decisions, and receive dividends. And you can claim a share of the assets only in the event of liquidation of the company itself, and only after the claims of creditors and holders of preferred shares are satisfied. Therefore, quite often, shareholders of common shares are left with nothing. And although, theoretically, a share gives you the right to influence the company's decisions through voting rights and to participate in the profits received through dividends, in practice, everything is not so simple. Let's take a specific example of Tesla. If you buy 1,000 shares of this company, but you will not be able to influence the decisions in this company, because there are more than 3.5 billion shares in circulation. And of course, given such a huge number of shares, you will be only one of tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of small shareholders like you. Therefore, even on such a simple decision as paying dividends, none of the minority shareholders have any influence. And you can influence this decision only by having either a controlling stake, 50% plus one share, which gives you the right to independently make decisions regarding the company's activities, or a blocking stake, which can be 20 to 25%, and gives you the right to veto to block any decision. Although even here there may be some nuances. As a rule, it is believed that one share provides one vote. However, this rule does not always work. Sometimes companies that want to raise new funding through a public offering without losing control of the company start issuing shares of different classes. They sell shares of one class with fewer votes on the market. And they issue higher class shares that provide more votes exclusively to insiders. Thus, you can be a shareholder of a company, but your vote will be smaller than the founder's vote. For example, each Class B share of the internet company Google, which can only be purchased by insiders, gives the owner 10 votes, while each Class A share that they issued in free circulation has only one vote. Or another example, when the Henry Ford family controls only 4% of the shares of Ford, but these shares provide them with 40% of the votes due to their preferred shares. There are also cases when governments issue such special shares in order not to lose control over companies. For example, in the UK, they came up with such an instrument as a golden share. This share left a conditionally small share of the state in the company, 15%, but gave the owner unlimited rights. Although formally the business was owned by private individuals, this share gave the government the right to a decisive vote, or veto, over any decision of the company. Decisions that conflict with state security and interests were prohibited. It was also forbidden for an individual shareholder to increase his share in the company to 15%. Any attempt to sell or take over the company was vetoed. And now the government controls such private companies as Rolls-Royce or BAE Systems. There are also other cases when the owners of the company can make an additional issue of shares and thus dilute the fate of other owners. If you saw the movie The Social Network about Mark Zuckerberg, then there Mark pulled such a trick to dilute the fate of his partner Eduardo Saverin. And then they sued for a long time on this issue. But if we talk about protecting the rights of all other shareholders who do not have either a controlling or blocking stake and cannot independently influence the company's decisions, such a body as the Supervisory Board was created. In general, why did this body appear? First of all, due to the development of joint stock companies and the appearance of a large number of shareholders in these companies. If you look at most modern large companies, you can immediately notice the absence of majority shareholders. For example, in General Motors, the largest shareholder has only 10% of the shares. That is, all shareholders are minority shareholders, and this situation is observed in almost any modern large company. In turn, all this leads to the fact that a large number of minority shareholders actually makes it impossible to coordinate actions between them in order to be able to manage the company. And the impossibility of coordination between minorities has led to the fact that during the management of the company, the issues of separation of ownership and control began to be raised. Simply put, this separation means that ownership and control are completely different things. In a modern company, owning part of the business does not mean control over it. And in order to control this business, you do not need to own it. In essence, the shareholders own the company, but the actual control is carried out by hired managers. In connection with this separation, related problems began to arise. One of them was called the principal-agent problem. The problem is that hired managers can pursue their personal interests that contradict the interests of shareholders. The main reason for such a problem is symmetric information. This is a situation where one party knows more about the real state of affairs than the other, but it is not profitable for them to tell for various reasons. Another problem of information asymmetry is that it is difficult to find out exactly how competent a manager is and whether he is worth his money. As a rule, a manager evaluates himself based on the results of past work. Basically, these results are often exaggerated or embellished in order to get a better offer elsewhere. After all, there are often situations when these results were obtained from a lucky coincidence and not due to the skills of the manager. For example, he can attribute to himself some achievements, the foundation for which was laid long before him. And it is practically impossible to actually check to what extent the manager's achievements belong to him personally. But again, no one will ever belittle their role. Quite the opposite. For this very reason, it is impossible to assess how much a manager is worth his money, or he is simply overestimated. Further, information asymmetry can consist in the fact that a manager is often hired to solve a problem. And he, being more competent in this matter, can see the unresolved issue in the current conditions. However, he agrees, because he sees for himself the prospect of improving his financial situation or increasing his status. This is just one example of many different situations. Ultimately, such situations lead to the fact that the manager begins to pursue his personal interests and not the interests of the company. And the shareholders will remain fools. And it was precisely to solve such problems that the Supervisory Board was created, which, first of all, would control the work of management so that they work in the interest of shareholders.